Okay, guys, we're moving into Chapter 2, Running. My father was the first in our immediate family to go to law school, a departure for our family and community from the more typical pursuit of fishing. My grandfather, Charlie Wilson, in addition to owning a gravel business, was amongst the first of the successful Cape Mudge scene boat owners. The Howe Sound 4. Oh, I mixed up on my Roman numerals. I think it's 4. Howe Sound 4 was magnificent in the day. In 1973, my dad graduated from University of British Columbia, UBC Law. He was the second Indigenous person to graduate. Our cousin, the late Justice Alfred Scow, was the first. It's a well-known tale that my dad started the annual trike race at the law school. I imagine some of the older graduates out there know what I'm referring to and are enjoying it. When I did eventually decide to go to law school in 1996, it was not really by choice, it was by design. I was to attend my dad's alma mater. I was okay with this, having been raised to be a leader in my world. Law school, albeit to learn about the white man's law, was a part of the plan. Preparation, I guess, for the inevitable work ahead for my community. At the time, law school was increasingly part of the path for young Indigenous people who wanted to help and work for their communities and nations. The courts were more and more on the front lines of the fight for Indigenous rights and justice, and in my heart, I knew it was one of the places I would have to be. To be honest, though, like many students, I was not that focused on a specific career path or really mindful of what leadership roles, if any, I might hold in the future. Yes, I knew what was expected of me, but I was also living life in the moment and taking it day by day. That's how I live, Jody, day at a time, day at a time. Still finding my way in two worlds. Law school was a good experience for the most part. I had the good fortune to attend with my sister, Corey. We could have been twins as far as many were concerned. We went through it together. For this I was grateful. We made many friends, some of whom we remain close to today. At UBC, as at University of Victoria for my undergrad, I did not join many clubs or societies. I certainly did not belong to any of the campus political organizations. Like my sister, I often felt like a fish out of water. The most exciting thing that happened in law school was that Corey had her first child, Kaya. I think it's Kaya, maybe? Sorry. 2 weeks prior to our graduation in 1999. This was so wonderful, and I was so excited to be an auntie. When we graduated, it was a big deal for our family. Dad, Granny, and Fred, her third husband, and so many others all came to our graduation ceremony, and Dad had a party for us at the Chateau Granville downtown. What a celebration and an amazing extended family reunion. Only Mum was missing. She was looking after baby Kaya. After law school, I articled at a medium-sized law firm in Vancouver, Connell Lightbody, and then moved on to provincial Crown as a prosecutor. I liked being in court regardless of the type of case. I was first hired in traffic court and then transferred down to 222 Main Street, the Central Criminal Courthouse in Vancouver. I certainly came to be responsible for my own courtroom, number 304. As it happens, when I was a minister in April 2016, I returned to number 304 and was so pleased to witness it operating as a specialized drug treatment court. Oh, times have changed in BC, guys. That David Eby's handing out drugs and Jody was doing something about it. Wow. Located on the downtown east side of Vancouver, 222 Main is a neighborhood that starkly reveals the great challenges Canada faces, including the severe disparities in wealth that exist and continue to worsen. The poverty in the area is crippling, not very different from the situation on so many Indian reserves across the country. With these disparities come high rates of drug addiction and violence. This is the neighborhood where serial killer Robert Pickton found many of his victims. It is one of the ground zeros for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And they were just going to, a few months ago, Robert Pickton was going to be eligible for day parole. Now that's me right now. And this goes back to how suspects have more rights than victims, because Pickton was going to be eligible for day parole. And Paul Bernardo just got transferred to medium security, and his roommate's Luca Magnotta, another freak serial killer, okay? And you can find, I have shorts on YouTube, you can find that. Unreal. Okay, anyways, back to it. That was a side note. Sorry, guys, sorry. So Robert Pickton found most of his women were the missing Indigenous women and girls. Okay, here we go. It was my experience as an Indigenous woman and working with people in the neighborhood and in our communities that made the announcement of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Is it Wake or is it MMIWG? If anybody's listening and you want to put that in the comment, that'd be great. Inquiry. Let me just go back there. Sorry, guys. Sorry. Okay. Wow. There's so much coming at me. So much coming at. Okay. Inquiry 2016, one of the most personally emotional and important moments for me as Minister of Justice. So many of the people and places in this neighborhood are beautiful and inspiring, but by anybody's standards, it is a hard place. On February 14th, I, along with thousands of others, joined the annual Women's Memorial March that starts in the intersection at Main and Hastings, a block and a half from the courthouse. It is empowering coming together of so many people working to remember and honor those lost and missing, and to take back the streets and bring about greater justice. The work at the courthouse was important. It was a learning experience for me, no question, but I also observed that in small ways and within the confines of legal reality, everyone there was trying to assist people and to advance justice. I will always remember the time I secured a peace bond called 810 on someone in order to protect his partner from violence. Later that night, the man who had been placed under the bond approached me when I was out at the Yale pub with friends. He pointed his finger at me and said, "You are that prosecutor." I looked at my friends and said it was time to leave. We did. The next day, I was on the ferry to Victoria washing my hands at the restroom sink, and a woman came in. Amazingly, it was the partner of the man from the day before. She burst into tears and said how grateful she was. I love doing this work. It was important. It allowed me to see firsthand how our criminal justice system is consumed by overrepresentation of Indigenous people and other marginalized Canadians. It also taught me the importance of innovation and reform to make a real difference in people's lives. Lots of effort was being made to figure out ways to do justice better, more compassionately and more humanely. Concepts like downtown community court were being formed. The native court workers were operational and various restorative justice measures were being discussed. At the time, I knew that I would not be long at Main Street. After about 3 years, it became apparent that I was being pulled and pushed into a next chapter of my life. Miles Richardson, Haida, I don't know what I'm saying here, and the Chief Commissioner of the British Columbia Treaty Commission, along with some others, had been trying to convince me for some time to join the commission as staff. The BC treaty process had begun in '93 among First Nations, the federal government, and the provincial government, with the intention that issues of title and rights in British Columbia would be settled within 5 years. The growing wave of title and rights court cases would be stemmed. There would be certainly on the land-based. First Nations would be self-governing, and the lives and well-beings of First Nations would be vastly improved. There would be justice. Some 10 years later, when I took a job as a process advisor at the BCTC, little or none of that had been achieved. Not one treaty had been completed, let alone the dozens and dozens that would have been required to settle the outstanding land question in British Columbia. About half of First Nations were not even participating in the process. One of the reasons was that they rejected the approach to negotiations taken by the federal and provincial governments. Some nations were also simply not internally ready for complex treaty making, and the BC Liberal government at the time was openly hostile to modern treaty making with the First Nations, and particularly to the idea of self-government and the protection of constitutionally entrenched rights. Okay, so the BC Liberal government was hostile. See, it doesn't matter. They're all the same, guys. This makes me so irritated. Okay. Because all they want to do is they just want to keep dividing everyone. It's so yesterday, guys. They went so far as to hold a province-wide referendum about rights for Indigenous peoples in relations to the Nisgaig's final agreement, which was one of the first modern treaty in the province, but was negotiated outside of the BC treaty process, and fought self-government in court and lost. Today, almost 2 decades later, the same challenges remain. Oh, of course they do, don't they, guys? That was me. Okay, back to it. Only 8 modern treaties, including the Nisgaig's final agreement, have been completed, and governments continue to use the process to try to limit, alter, and even extinguish Indigenous rights rather than uphold and honor them. I expect the denial of rights, would be one of the first things to go when I became Minister of Justice and Attorney of Canada, as the approaches were completely irreconcilable with the federal Liberal commitments made in the 2015 election. As I write this, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs CIRNA continue to largely negotiate in the same way as when I went into the Commission. So disappointing. In going to the British Columbia Treaty Commission, I did not have any illusions that this struggling process could easily undergo the transformation it needed. After all, the core of the challenges lay with Crown governments, and there was little the Commission, even though established by legislation as the keeper of the process, could do to change or control them. Mandates are set by governments, and in this area of public policy more rigidly than in others, Any changes depend on the will and competence of the government and the priorities and motivation of the sitting Prime Minister or Premier of his or her cabinet. But as my dad had taught me, there was no merit in focusing on the obstacles. If one knows the change that is needed, then the mission is to relentlessly pursue that change in a principled and coherent manner and to look for allies. That was his example, and I had learned from it. I had taken a 1-year leave of absence from being a prosecutor to work for the commission. However, 9 months into the job, I was convinced, somewhat reluctantly, to run for election to one of the 2 treaty commissioner positions appointed by the First Nations Summit. This was my first time, aside from student council, pursuing an elected leadership role. I remember my dear friend Jack Weisgerber, sorry guys, at the time the BC appointed commissioner to the BCTC, saying to me as I don't know what that word is, about my decision. Ruminated about my decision. I don't know. Don't be such a chicken shit, just do it. The first political speech I ever gave was to the chiefs who would vote in the election. I had 5 minutes. My dad had helped me write it, and I rehearsed it over and over again. The all candidates forum was being held at the Chief Joe Mathis Center on the Squamish Nation land in North Vancouver. It was packed. When I stood up to present, my mind went blank. I could not think of anything. For what it seemed like minutes, I could not speak. Imagine a would-be Indigenous political leader standing in front of leaders who had gone before her, done and said so much, and from whom she had learned so much, having nothing to say. I looked over at my chiefs, the Musqueamog Tassaneck chiefs, who always sat to the right of the front, and I saw their supportive and I feel like Dumb and Dumber, you know, and he's like, we'll host the anticipatory faces is, I think, what I was trying to say. Okay, I started speaking and the words finally came. Thank goodness. You and me both, Jody, you and me both. Okay, back to it. How's everyone doing? Anybody need a pee break, water break? Okay, do it now, okay? Alright, it was soon after winning the first election that I became aware of being my own person in the Indigenous political world, rather than how I had always been known as Bill Wilson's daughter. It is a strange sensation to be primarily known as someone's child. I always felt great pride in being identified this way, but it could also be a burden. For me, I realized the challenge, the burden, was too simple, was to simply make the jump into leadership as I had been prepared to do. I certainly had a zeal to pursue real change for our peoples, as I had been taught. But I have never felt I had to lead in the same way or style as my father, or measure up to him and his accomplishments. Indeed, I think when one is driven by the desire to live up to the ideal of one's parent, it can lead to poor decisions. Such a greater preoccupation with appearance than substance. Being a treaty commissioner was also my first direct introduction into the unique world of contemporary Indigenous politics. It is not for the faint of heart. It does not always match the ideal that I describe when I speak publicly to our values and worldviews. In part, some of the problems are a symptom of the challenges inherited in deconstructing a colonial past, while still being very much a part of colonial framework and influenced and governed by it. People can sometimes be harsh, and thick skin is a must. Indigenous politics remain to this day very colonial and very male centered, although this is changing. The Indian Act and the institutions it supports perpetuate this reality. The misogyny exhibited by some around the Assembly of First Nations executive table was just an example of this. So she, like, points out that there are, jerks in every crowd, right? We got jerks in at the Assembly of First Nations, and you got jerks up in the Sussex Drive, you know what I'm saying? Okay. Indigenous people are healing, and as individuals, each of us are at a different place along the spectrum of the decolonizing. This is true of Indigenous leaders as well, and as in human societies throughout history, women have borne the brunt of some of the hardest and inequalities this creates. But Indigenous politics is also something in an important and good way. Most people in Indigenous politics at all levels have a stated and shared goal, a common purpose to outrun the shadow of colonialism, whether they realize they are colonialized or not, whether they may or may not be a part of the problem they are trying to fix. This includes the linked and equally important objectives of improving the basic quality of life for their people, putting food on the table and a roof over their heads, maintaining and advancing our cultures, traditions, and languages, and reclaiming the relationship with our lands and resources. To do all of this requires the institutions of governance to be strong and appropriate, and where necessary, rebuild and recognized by other governments. Most Indigenous leaders I have worked with would agree with these basic goals. Where there is divergence is how we pursue achieving them. But at least we have dialogue, sometimes endless, vigorous dialogue about how we get there. In one way, this is good and necessary. It is a part of how we build consensus and move forward together. At times, however, dialogue can be weaponized to stop change and maintain the status quo. Indigenous leaders and people can use dialogue and claims of the need for more dialogue to give in to fear of real change, and many non-Indigenous politicians have learned this and use it to their advantage. These politicians make claims of being change makers, but subtly and not so subtly push in ways that instigate endless rounds of consultation and engagement among Indigenous people so that nothing really has changed. This is a pattern I would see play itself out time and again after I became minister. There have been a convergence in thinking among Indigenous peoples on what needs to be done. This growing unity of purpose and direction has made it harder for other actors, including governments, to try to divide and conquer Indigenous peoples or make excuses for inaction. It made my own experience later in cabinet even more disappointing, knowing how much more could have been done. These patterns for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous politicians are symptoms of colonialization. The effects of colonialization are within each of us as much as they are in our social realities, culture, law, policies, and institutions. Patterns of thought and actions have been shaped often in unseen ways by the experience of colonization. For First Nations people, this is seen in how we have internalized aspects of being an Indian, often feeling dissociated inside ourselves from our true identities, who we are, and the very places to which we belong. Of course, the residential schools were a major part of this, something my father was shielded from, and that were closing when Corey and I were growing up. It was my grandfather, Charlie Wilson, who himself had been at residential school, who protected my father from going, using the resources he had to move my grandmother and dad to Comox. There, my dad attended public school. He was the only Indigenous kid in the school, and though we do not know for sure, we think he may have been the first. One might say my grandfather was undertaking an act of resistance to colonialization and pushing back in a way that has long been a part of my family's lineage. Just checking the time. How's everyone doing, guys? My grandfather was able to protect my dad because he had the means, as well as a well-off fisherman, and the local connections to make it happen. Most did not. We were lucky. For non-Indigenous people, this internal colonialization is seen in the ingrained, casual, often unrecognized racism and paternalism that, I don't know what I'm saying there, sorry, that is frequently present in interactions. I have witnessed this ever since I was a child. The expression of amazement and surprise that an Indigenous girl would be good in school or sports, or that her teeth were not rotten. The lack of expectations for achievement, other than from my own family and community, of course, from some amazing teachers. The subtle and not so subtle questioning of whether one had done their work on their own or earned the position or recognition they got. Unsurprisingly, all of these patterns emerged during the time I was Minister of Justice and Attorney General, including from some cabinet colleagues. Can't wait to find out who that is, Jody. Summer coming to mind. Sorry, I just had a water break. Okay, you guys do you too, okay? Alright, okay, checking time, back at it, okay. Deciding to run for the... Here, let me slow down. Let's gear down for a sec, okay. Deciding to run for regional chief was an easy choice to make. It felt like everything lined up. I was frustrated with the treaty process and saw little change in my role as treaty commissioner to move negotiations in a new direction. I was restless and wanted to do more in leadership. Tim was really supportive and excited about the idea. I had a plan I wanted to advance with self-government and nation building at the center. And just as I was feeling all these things, Sean became national chief and there was an opening. I went for it. My first election was for the position in 2009. It was hotly contested. I had to beat 4 other candidates, including the, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip of Silix, Okanagan, who was the longtime president of the Union of the BC Indian Chiefs. Stuart and I had known of each other previously, but our friendship was cemented during that campaign. We really got to know and respect each other. When he threw his support to me on the 3rd ballot with a powerful statement that we needed young Indigenous women in leadership, the die was cast. While he and I pursued justice and decolonialization in somewhat different ways, I know we have always shared the same goal of transformation in the lives of Indigenous peoples, grounded in the recognition and implementation of our inherited title and rights, and we remain friends to this day. I won my second mandate in 2012 with 78% of the vote on the 1st ballot, reflecting, I believe, that the focus I have been placing on Indigenous self-government and nation rebuilding was supported, and that the consensus style of leadership rooted in building trust among the chiefs was desired and needed. Being regional chief also put me on the First Nations Leadership Council with 6 other leaders, including Stewart. For most of the time, I was the only woman, which brought with it the usual challenges. Over the years, I was played different political roles. I would find myself wondering what the conversations and dynamics were like at the tables I was not at. What the dialogue was the dialogue different? Did people think or act differently? Did they pursue change in the same way? Did people use the power they had in the best way possible? I reflected on one aspect of this in a talk on Indigenous women in politics and law that I gave in October 2018. I had no idea at the time I was soon to be shuffled out of my position as Minister of Justice. So this was Jody's speech for that. In my own experience serving as the first Indigenous person to be Canada's Minister of Justice and Attorney General, I have unfortunately had to reinforce that when addressing Indigenous issues, no matter what table one sits around, or in what position, or with what title and appearance of influence and power, the experience of marginalization can still carry with you, but this does not deter me. It only makes my resolve stronger and more determined. As the male members of the Leadership Council were learning about me, I was also gauging and learning to work with them. Ultimately, we worked fairly well together, my main regret being that we were not able to always get on the same page about doing bigger and bolder things. But these were great times. I was energized by the work by all my fantastic all-female staff. I doubt any regional or national Indigenous political organization had an all-female staff before. If they had, they were far and few between. We were an amazing team of 5, and like most Indigenous organizations then, we had to do much with little. My early experience in leadership had helped my belief, which had already been instilled in me by my dad and grandmother, that at its core, decolonialization in Canada is the right to self-determination, including self-government, and that Indigenous people should be supported in exercising that right to rebuild their nations and governments. Governance reform was at the heart of my almost 6 years as BC Regional Chief, and building our success was the motto. One centerpiece of our governance work was the creation of the BCAFN Governance Toolkit, a guide to nation building, including the second edition of the Governance Report, collectively 3 volumes totaling more than 1,000 pages. It covers every topic that has been addressed as part of rebuilding First Nations governments, drawing on Indigenous laws, protocols, and traditions, and moving beyond the Indian Act. It considers the legislative tools available as well as the impediments, and highlighted what needed to be done so support and recognition of the Indigenous self-government in Canada. This was a project that Tim and I talked about for some time and had been working on prior to my election as BC Regional Chief. It was a large project for the BCAFN to undertake, but it was a true pleasure to document and recognize all of the incredible work done by our nations in BC. In addition to the support of the chiefs, we had the resources to get it done, including the advice of Indigenous leaders and others who had done the real work of rebuilding governance beyond the Indian Act. and a peer review group of experts against whom the ideas could be tested. As it happened, self-government was central to my first political interactions with the federal government as regional chief. These interactions were sometimes testy. As Indigenous issues were heating up across the country, I was asked to give one of the speeches on behalf of the AFN at the Crown First Nations gathering in 2012, a speech that focused on self-governance and economic development. The event opened with Prime Minister Harper giving remarks. He spoke of the Indian Act tree and its roots, implying that the Indian Act was formidable and hard to unearth, and that our nations did not have the ability or capacity to move beyond it. It was ignorant, and I was infuriated, as I would be a year later when I sat at the table with him in Langevin. At the gathering, I quickly rewrote part of my speech in order to rebut the Prime Minister's message. I used the phrase, "with all due respect, Mr. Prime Minister," numerous times as I dissected and rejected his comments. As the chiefs, spectacular in their regalia, applauded my remarks with standing ovations, I could see that the Prime Minister was not looking directly at me. John Duncan, who was the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs and my Member of Parliament, Vancouver Island North, and with whom I was friendly, was fuming. Afterwards he said angrily, "Jody, do you know what 'with all due respect' means? It means fuck you." I was somewhat glad he had interpreted my message properly, though perhaps crudely. I felt I had said what needed to be said and what my chiefs had wanted to say. Okay, guys, I'm going to break and I'm going to go have dinner. My focus on governance also did not help me much in navigating the dynamics at the national level with the AFN. The reality is that most First Nations that are far along in their self-government work do not participate regularly at the AFN. The assemblies of all the chiefs from across the country sometimes end up mirroring the kind of dynamics one sees in certain Indian Act band councils, or in the tensions that can arise as communications with hereditary and elected systems figure out their roles and responsibilities in the contemporary world. The Indian Act treats Indigenous people as children. It is colonial paternalism. I don't know what that is. At its core, resting on its racist belief that Indigenous people are uncivilized and cannot govern themselves. Indian Agents, INAC, and the current Indigenous Service Canada, ISC, manage a colonial piece of legislation that systematically disempowers people and creates a climate of powerlessness. In such a reality, it is natural that a disproportionate amount of time at assemblies ends up being spent on things that in terms of the bigger picture and what needs to be done do not matter. This is how colonialism designs it. It is also not atypical that the important things are left unattended because one is restricted in how to deal with them, and there may be costs to doing so. A degree of fear and avoidance of pushing for real change sets in. Oh, I gotta turn a light on, guys. One sec. Okay, I'm sitting back at the desk, okay? I was trying to be comfy, cozy, but I didn't have much light, okay? How are you guys doing? Are you guys doing okay? You in a comfy spot? Alright. So while the Assembly of First Nations has a role, and it is certainly one that means Indians have to push and lobby for change. We have to create the organizations that can drive the change we want to see. Or we need to look, as has been done in the past, to restructure the AFN. National chiefs are needed who can build trust and support to transform the organization and what it stands for. This was not what the national executive was focused on doing when I was regional chief. And while I was being encouraged to take that on instead of moving to federal politics, ultimately I do not think it was the right time. In April 2014, when I told Justin I was all in, I knew it was going to be an interesting transition from Indigenous politics to mainstream Canadian politics. Not many had done it before, at least not while being an active regional chief, so there was no real playbook to follow. For some of the transition, I knew what to expect. First was the need to complete the publication of the governance toolkit. Then there was the need to get clearance from the BCAFN Board of Directors to run and take a leave of absence. I had a great sense of loyalty and responsibility to the work that we had done and were still doing in BC, and did not want to see any of it fail or slow down. So it just meant working harder to keep things moving as I started shifting to preparation for the federal nomination campaign. There was also some expected resistance from the Indigenous world of politics beyond BC, as well as some silliness. A few chiefs complained about my candidacy, alleging that it was a conflict of interest to remain as regional chief while standing for the Liberal Party nomination. But in the end, none of the complaints or resistance amounted to anything. There was no conflict, and the BCAFN chiefs in assembly adopted a unanimous resolution in support of my nomination and expressing full confidence that I would be able to continue to perform my duties as regional chief. The early resistance was just an expression of the more broken edges of Indigenous politics, but there were surprises as I moved out of the world of Indigenous politics and into getting ready for and then mounting a federal general election campaign. Of course, I knew well that a main distinction between these two political worlds was that in Indigenous politics there are no political parties, unlike in the federal system. Indigenous politics does not divide along partisan lines, although there can be fractions. Indeed, the idea of partisan has always felt foreign to me and continues to feel that way to this day. Part of this is simply a reflection of Indigenous integrative worldviews, to organize around difference and then to emphasize that difference, especially a difference that is manufactured like a political party, feels and is unnatural. As the Liberal Party brought me into its world, I could feel this difference right away. It was disorienting. I was immediately struck by the mentality of being on a team or in a club that spent a lot of the time talking and strategizing about how to beat others and win. Oh yeah, don't we know that? In the Indigenous world of politics, we would certainly foster and encourage team building, but the dialogue was always focused on how to build momentum to achieve a social outcome, to address wrongs, and to better the lives of people. Moreover, everyone was a part of the team, not just those in your party. The team was the collective. The team on council at Wee-Waa-Caw was all of us. The team at the BCAFN was all the chiefs and their communities. My new reality felt weird to me, and I imagine I seemed a bit weird to them. Many of the federal Liberals I met had dedicated their adult lives, some from the age of 14, when they could officially become a young liberal, to finding a way to win and to believe that the other guys were bad. That's about right. That's how it goes, Jody. Now they felt they were getting close to winning federally. Many had never been in power, and here I showed up clearly an outsider, not a party member until after the convention, never having contributed a dime or any of my time to their team or to the cause. It was not quite like oil and water. I do not want to exaggerate. By far and away, the people were great, and we were certainly able to mix. But there were others with whom things weren't so smooth. In these cases, it felt as if we were rarely, if ever, talking in the same way about the same thing. This group I saw as being liberal first, above all else, and they identified as such. It was quite something. I knew I could never be that kind of a liberal, a die-hard partisan, as it was not a primary or core part of my identity. Related to partisanship, of course, power, and a different conception of power animates Indigenous and mainstream Canadian politics. In our Canadian political culture, the goal is not only to become government, but to stay in government. I came to realize that this goal, to hang on to power, is a paramount objective through which every decision is filtered. Sure, one can convince oneself, as many do, that there is no distinction between staying in power and what is good for the country, that what the country needs to guide and protect it is above all else you. Arrogant but necessary, as the other guys are so bad. But of course, that is just human ego and narcissism talking, and is sometimes said the human capacity for self-delusion is infinite. That was pretty deep there, Jody. Oh. From the earliest days, I felt within the party this preoccupation with power and with the notion that somehow the Federal Liberal Party was going to be the savior of Canada. To me, it came across, and still does, as a recipe for close-mindedness and not listening to divergent views. Not conducive to making the best decisions. Good ideas can come from anyone, anywhere, regardless of what party label they ascribe to themselves. To spend so much time in this world fighting against arbitrary distinctions that have been the source of discrimination, race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, disability, health, and yet we are using the arbitrary distinction of a party label as the determinant of an idea's merit. Of course, this Liberal Party focus on keeping power only became more profound when the party was in government. I believe the Prime Minister and those around him convinced themselves of the importance of staying in government for the good of the country, that their beliefs and approach were effectively unassailable. Sorry, I heard my stomach rumble in there, guys. I think this is a sense of self-importance can lead people in power to do and say whatever is necessary to hold on to power, with decisions being driven by political I don't know, and not an authentic confrontation with challenges we face as a country, as a world, and as humans. Power and the desire to cling to power can change people of any political party as they move away from the core values and principles. Yeah, oh yeah, it got away on Trudeau, didn't it? He's just clinging to that power. He's cheating too while he plays. He's like that kid that cheats. Okay, sorry guys. I'm really trying hard to bite my tongue, okay? The triumphant of power and partisanship over truth and principle was a major part of my experience as a member of the Trudeau government. I do not want to romanticize Indigenous politics. Indeed, I am probably one of the last people to do so, and Indigenous women generally are far less likely to romanticize it. The Indigenous politics, there are self-interested people and those who want to be in power positions for the sake of being in those positions. But even those people carry with them the experience and reality of a community in need with children and families suffering, where cultural and social oppression remain, and intergenerational trauma continues to play itself out. And even those who act like typical politicians come from somewhere with a culture and tradition that speaks to what is expected in leadership and from leaders. They all have elders. They also live knowing the reality of having rights violated. These realities are always front of mind. They ground the work when it goes astray. The need for true politics, the collective doing better through striving to make the best decisions together and implementing them successfully on the ground is ever present. Roots run far deeper than a policy convention held somewhere in the country once or twice a year, or a platform that is rolled out every 4 or 5 years to try to win an election and have power. As harsh as it sounds, sitting today as an independent MP in the corner of the House of Commons, looking around at an empty posturing and game playing that is unfortunately all too dominant, I feel like I'm in an environment that has lost its soul. Yes. And guys, I was just on today this morning talking about the wacko situation, okay? You know how Pierre and the Conservatives, well, Pierre got tossed out and the rest of the Conservatives left over that wacko thing. Anyways, guys, well, it's 8:27 p.m. Eastern time, okay? My eyes are getting a little bit blurry, okay? Back at it. She's in an environment that has lost its soul. Yep, it's down there in Ottawa, House of Commons, okay? The sense of purpose that many hardworking and well-meaning members of Parliament bring to Ottawa when first elected is obscured in an environment that feels more like the worst reality show than a place where people are truly trying to effect the best change for Canadians. On the more positive side, I did not feel any barriers to running for the federal Liberal Party because I was a woman. This would not have been the case a few years ago, and I imagine it is still not the case for many. Even though we still have a ways to go, things are getting better for women running for political office. I may have been a fish out of water, but at least for the time of the campaign, I had the support of the party like any other candidate, perhaps even more so because some saw me as a star candidate. I understood this to mean that not only did I have a chance to win an important riding, but I could also potentially be helpful to the party on a national scale. Indeed, I was strategically placed to be seen wherever Justin was in town, and even went on a trip with the leader, which was not common. Of course, part of this was tokenism, and I was well aware of that. For all the disorientation that came with the transition, ultimately it felt straightforward. I knew why I was doing it. This was the next path that had unfolded. It was carrying on the leadership role I had been raised to take, just from a different venue. And the focus remained the same, to build a better Canada based on certain core values and principles. This included better governance and greater justice, equality and inclusion, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all Canadians. So as my nomination candidacy became official and I became more enriched in the political party my focus appropriately started to shift. If anything, I knew that when I set my mind to something, I worked hard at it. And I also threw myself into preparations for the campaign, building an organized approach, much as I had in my time at the BCAFN. While my mind would creep ahead to the change I could advance if I did get to Ottawa in a position of influence, I did not think about it much. I knew it would be different and it would be hard, but I had hope for the future and was ready to help make that hope a reality. I did not know exactly what would happen next. When Justin said he would tell the party I was to be the candidate in Vancouver Granville, I was not part of what unfolded internally to secure the nomination for me. From media articles written over the years and from some of my own conversations with those in the know, I'm aware of the names of several people who wanted to run in Vancouver Granville at the time, one who would end up running against me in the riding for the Liberals 4 years later. Those people either chose not to run or were told not to run for the nomination in 2015. I am not sure. I assumed they were told not to do so. I was intent on working for my nomination, as I did not want anyone to be able to say I did not earn it. So I did what I understood you were supposed to do. I started to create a team of volunteers. We sold memberships, met with countless local party people, including those I knew or suspected wanted to run as well. Many on the already established electoral district association were not happy. Whatever their reasons, I respected their position and knew I had to try to rebuild relationships with these people. I met with each of them to hear from them and also to talk about myself, my background, and why I was running. Some were very welcoming, some not so much, and through them I also sought to learn about the Liberal Party and the riding. Vancouver Granville was a new riding in 2015, and I wanted to understand what had been done in the past and what was needed for the future. Tim and I also moved into the riding. We bought a condo just off Cambie Street near the police station and just down the street from our iconic City Hall. With a place to live and a growing, of friends and supporters, we set forth in relative ignorance to confirm the nomination and run our first federal election campaign. In the mindset of this excitement and expectation of what might be accomplished with our team, with some general skepticism that an Indigenous woman could win in Vancouver Granville. In fairness, I think many held this view just as a matter of pure demographics. It was not a comment on me, Indigenous people, or beliefs or attitudes of people in the riding. Vancouver Granville is an incredibly diverse riding, both in terms of its social economic makeup and in terms of the so-called political party spectrum. But the average price of a single home in 2015 was about $2 million. Oh, okay, that was 2015. What is it now? $2 million in 2015. Sorry guys, I just had to take a drink. You guys, how are you doing? Okay. I remember talking to a prominent community leader who expressed concern to me that he did not think an Indigenous person could win in this neighborhood. As he said that, I remember feeling my determination grow to prove him wrong. More importantly, I wanted to prove that this place where I was born was and is a place where if you work hard, bring forward ideas, and engage with people, it does not matter what you look like, where you're from, who you love, where you worship. I think my confidence came from a familiarity with living in multiple worlds, one of which not so dissimilar to Van Gran. My schools in Comox could have been in Vancouver Granville, diverse, fairly privileged, and not very Indigenous. At the same time, though, I had another life away from school with my cousins in community on the potlatch circuit, and in the summer back at Cape Mudge with my grandmother, aunts, uncles, and cousins, so many cousins. In that world, I felt most at home, knowing best who I was, but having this life did not mean I could not connect with the kids in Comox. I think my two worlds experience is fairly typical for many First Nations kids growing up in Canada. The reality is that First Nations people know far more about how non-Indigenous people live their lives in this country than what non-Indigenous Canadians know about life on the reserve. The reserve and far beyond that, our cultural ways seem foreign to many Canadians. But the neighborhoods and cities of Canada do not necessarily feel that foreign to many of us. I was confident that I could navigate the world of Vancouver Granville, even if the voters at this point did not know me or my Indigenous world. My formal nomination meeting was held on July 31st, 2014 at the Holy Trinity Anglican Church on West 12th Avenue. Gordon Gibson, a prominent Vancouver Granville resident, political columnist, author, and former politician, introduced me, and many prominent Indigenous leaders and Liberals from BC came out to support me. I felt very honored. Reading today the words I said that night, I cringed. The talk reflects the message and values I had always talked about and continue to: good governance, trust, and consensus building, equality and inclusion, and justice for Indigenous peoples. But the speech also reveals how much I had begun playing into the partisan political game and projecting a belief in the image the Liberal Party wanted to construct. While I know I sincerely believe and meant every word that I spoke at the time, and as I'm reminded everyone in the room did as well, I cringe today because I know it is, to a great degree, an imaginary and ideal image, and I guess I'm surprised that I ever subscribed to it quite that much. I always felt I would never drink the Kool-Aid. I think it shows how convincing Trudeau was, or perhaps how desperate we all were for hope in a different way of doing politics. I hear the old line about self-delusion ringing in my ears, and I look back on my words. Okay, this was Jody's speech. But most of all, thanks to all of you for coming out and showing just how much support there is in our riding for Justin and Justin's team. Tonight is all about continuing to take back control of our country from those who currently govern and have demonstrated a profoundly different and divisive vision of what our Canada is and should be. But with hope and hard work, as Justin says, supported by a strong plan, we can and will put Canada back on track. I have in fact been fighting for what we know as Liberal values my whole life. This government, the Harper government, has been systematically tearing apart everything that is good about Canada, and we have a responsibility to stop this. It gets even worse. This is about what she says about her speech. There is a better way, the Liberal way, based on our Liberal values, which are Canadian values, and under the demonstrated and strong leadership of Justin Trudeau. My approach has always been that when I see something wrong, when I see something that needs to be changed, I get involved. I have met and worked with Justin Trudeau. I like him. I trust him. He has a good mind and a great heart. I no wonder she regrets this. Sorry, guys. I like the way he is reaching out and bringing people together in common cause. He has given me hope that working together we can bring a government of good people and great integrity to Ottawa to make the changes that will make all of our lives and our country better. That is why I have put my name forward for Justin and the Liberal Party. And some of my words that night ring true today in ways that I never imagined at the time. So this goes back to her letter. I think it's ending here, guys. Unfortunately, and it is a great concern for me, far too many Canadians, including many here in our riding, have become disillusioned with politics and disengaged from our politician. This is one of the greatest threats to our democracy. When our voices are lost, our opportunities are diminished. 4 days after I secured the nomination, Trudeau was in town. The day of my nomination was planned around the leader being in Vancouver to attend the Vancouver Pride Parade along with all his BC candidates. I remember that day. That was me, not Jody. I remember that day, guys, and I want to be talking about that. Okay, anyways. On August 5th, we had a picnic at Douglas Park in the center of Vancouver, Granville. Throngs of people showed up. Justin was the rock star, and he was there in part, I know, to show me off and springboard my campaign. All the other confirmed Liberal candidates in the area were strongly encouraged to come to the picnic. This would become the pattern to follow. All of us were expected to attend any event where the leader was to be. I introduced him to the ruckus crowd and had my first introduction to political selfies. That has never stopped, indeed, ever since the SNC-Lavalin affair. The attention, including requests for selfies, has only intensified exponentially so after being kicked off Team Trudeau. Just checking the time, make sure it's going, guys. Sorry. After the picnic, Justin and I flew north to the pristine Great Bear Rainforest, Prince Rupert, and Hartley Bay to meet First Nations people in the area to view the route that the proposed Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline would take. The pipeline had long been controversial and later would be killed by the government, while others were approved in a compromise decision that pleased almost no one. This was the most time I had ever spent with Justin so far. We met with Indigenous and local leaders. We flew to Hartley Bay to visit the Gigat First Nation Tishian community at the mouth of the Douglas Channel. Elderly women waved through their windows as we walked around the community. We gathered in their band office with some of their leaders, all of whom I knew. There was a sense of excitement and hope. I was happy to have been able to travel into this community with Justin, to be with him, as he heard directly from these Indigenous leaders. The trip was also magical as we were immersed in the beauty of the natural world. We saw humpback whales, bubble neck feeding as we made our way back to the airport. It was an extraordinary sight. The trip was also one big photo op. Of course it was. That's me, guys. One big photo op. Where's that? Adam Scotty, Justin's accomplished photographer, was with us and took endless photos. A shot of Justin and me talking on a rocky beach on Digby Island near Prince Rupert ended up adorning the environmental page of the platform. I don't know if I said that right. Anyways, this was certainly helpful for my campaign, and other candidates were not so lucky. I ticked the boxes for the party that needed ticking. This is obvious. After this trip, I started getting involved more nationally in the platform development, especially on the environment and on Indigenous issues. I was glad to do so to contribute some of my experience and expertise on the issues on which I wanted to see bold action. I was pleasantly surprised how open the party was to accepting language regarding the recognition of Indigenous rights, which was how Indigenous peoples had talked about the transformative change that was needed for decades. I realized in hindsight that the Liberal Party did not understand what this really meant or did not care, but at the time, the inclusion only reinforced my belief that I was doing the right thing. Later, it became clear that what was in the platform did not really matter that much. The platform was simply to get elected. The about face on electoral reform in 2016 was the first big public indication of this for me. All that real change, right? In the electoral reform. Oh, guys, how did we get here, guys? How about, can we start thinking about that, guys? How did we get here? Okay, let's start scratching our heads, guys. While I was excited to get campaigning, I also knew it would feel awkward for me. After all, I'm really an introvert, or at least I recognize that I have increasingly become so over the years. I know that is not how people see me or experience my public persona, but I am not a big fan of crowds and I do not seek out opportunities to speak in public or with the media. I like my privacy, but I do love people, meeting people and talking with them about their lives or their issues of importance. Me too, me too. I feel most comfortable one-on-one or in a very small groups. As Tim always liked to remind me when we were campaigning for a politician, I'm very perplexing and it drove him crazy in a good way. I do not think about where to stand or finding the mic or getting in the shot, and I do not give easy sound bites. I have had communication directors whom I have made equally frustrated. They are always encouraging me to do more of the political or media stuff because it's necessary and they think I'm good at it, but I do not enjoy that stuff at all. When I was young, I was quite outgoing, always curious and always up to mischief. I remember being happy as a child, even though there were many challenging times, including periods when Corey and I were away from our parents. As I got older, and with taking on the responsibility of leadership roles, I can see how I was protective of myself when I was younger and continue today from many, or recede from many social connections. As an adult, I think this is also a survival mechanism to manage the scale and scope of the expectations of being in leadership and the massive amount of energy and time the work it requires. This was especially so when I was a minister. To self-preserve, I think I have become a little more closed off and spend more and more time on introspection as part of coping with the stresses and sleepless nights that build up. By the time my journey into federal politics had begun, I immediately recognized that a life of leadership meant a life of sacrifice and that sometimes the cost can be very personal. I had seen this firsthand in how leadership had taken its tolls on leaders in my family and community, including on their health and well-being and that of those around them. Indeed, this toll is seen in leaders from walks of life and many backgrounds. As part of coming to understand what leadership may involve, I had to come to terms with the reality that for me, the leadership roles contributed to our not having children. I desperately wanted children, as did Tim. We tried in all ways possible and suffered many losses along the way, but if I am honest, there is a part of me that knows the health impacts of the work I was doing made it much harder for me to get pregnant and stay pregnant. In my quiet, darker moments, this haunts me, and I know it always will. And so I often find myself looking for calm inside myself and in the world I create around me. For most Canadians, the We Charity and We Day are now just names in another Liberal scandal. For Tim and me, they are much more. It was while speaking at the 2011 We Day event in Vancouver at Rogers Arena and in front of thousands of kids that I started to have a miscarriage. Literally, while on stage, I could feel it. After I finished my welcoming remarks, I left the stage, found a toilet, and cleaned myself up. And then I went to meet Mikhail Gorbachev, who was speaking that day. Then I went to the hospital. Wow. Sorry that happened, Jody. I don't even know. Like, you hear about these scandals, guys? Like we know that happened. Well, we know, guys. But nobody wanted to look into it because if you questioned Trudeau, you were a racist, right, guys? Right? Right? Because he's such a feminist. Oh, sorry about that, Jody. That must have been hard. Okay, I get back to it. Increasingly turning inward and greater self-reflection has helped me, I think, to try to maintain balance and stay focused on the most important things, even as I perform leadership roles. I had not closed off at this point, but I was certainly no longer revealing myself as I did when I was younger, and it did not mean I was not open to other people and their needs and views, or empathetic, quite the contrary. But it did mean that some of the dynamics of campaigning would not be my happy place and I would need help. There was never any question that I would ask Lee Nicholson Mackenzie to manage my campaign. Lee is an Indigenous woman from Tupeke, New Brunswick, and it's often remarked that we are kind of doppelgangers or that we are like sisters. Apparently, we share many mannerisms and styles of laughter. Lee and I met many years ago. She is the type of kind, caring, and fierce person that anyone would be fortunate to meet, let alone call a friend. She really is my best friend. Writing about her makes me emotional, as I am so grateful to have her and her husband Rick in my life. Tim feels the same way. Lee has taken her own remarkable journey. She has been, among other things, Chief of Staff to National Chief Phil Fontaine, So Chief to Prime Minister Paul Martin at 24 Sussex Drive, and a consultant for the 2010 Vancouver Olympics. There was no way I was going to take this step without Lee helping to lead the way, and I also knew that if I made it to Ottawa, I would need to have Lee there to help me to make things move along smoothly. She was and still is a confidant. As Lee, Tim, and I began plotting out the campaign, people started coming out of the woodwork to help, reflecting my idea of what it meant to be a leader. The campaign was a collaborative effort from the start. A few of the people who joined us were campaigners from within the Liberal Party apparatus. With them, they brought considerable knowledge and experience that was helpful, and we were fast learners. But far the most wonderful part of the campaign and its absolute backbone were the volunteers, those people who came out on a daily basis. Every volunteer has their own story for being involved. An early team of people, most of whom had volunteered on some type of political campaign before, felt that something special was happening, that somehow this was different than the campaigns they had been involved in the past. I wasn't sure exactly what was different, having never been involved in one myself, but the optimism and excitement was palpable. It was fun. We had purpose and we became friends for life. While victory was not assured. The polls went back and forth. We knew we could win if we worked hard and got the vote out. It was grueling 11-week official campaign running from August 2nd to Election Day, which was on October 19th, 2015. That amounted to 78 days, the longest federal election campaign in recent history. When I think of it, my mind often goes to door knocking, so much door knocking. I had not knocked on doors for many things in my life. Indeed, in Indigenous communities, such a sight would not be commonplace, and certainly federal and provincial political candidates rarely ventured onto the reserve. I do not remember ever seeing a candidate back at Camp Mudge, let alone one knocking on our doors. Another dynamic on the campaign was the reality of being what the party considered a high-profile candidate. This had its benefits. The party certainly was supportive. We knew this, as polling was shared with us in ways that few other candidates got to see. It also meant a lot of calls from Jerry and others. Of course, these calls may have been because Lee and I were somewhat eager and often reached out to them to ask for things or advice. As novice campaigners, we wanted to understand everything as best we could, but being high profile also came the challenges. The party was convinced from the start of the campaign that Vancouver-Granville was going to be a victory, much like the ridings of Vancouver, Quadra, and Vancouver Centre. Following Lee's lead, and with all of our tremendous volunteers, we ended up with one of the highest performing ridings in the country in terms of contacts with voters as well as fundraising. By the midpoint of the campaign, we became a model for the Liberal Party's field team program in BC, which also meant that the party was trying to take some of our best people to help out in other ridings. This was understandable, but our volunteers were really dedicated and did not want to leave, and of course Lee and I did not want them to. We were not taking anything for granted, and we worked all out until the last minute. Never count your chickens before the eggs have hatched, as they say. Perhaps one of the most upsetting aspects of the campaign was dealing with racist comments from within the Liberal Party. One Liberal MP and candidate put an ad in an Indigenous paper congratulating Indigenous grads with the tagline, "Sobriety, education, and hard work leads to success." The candidate did apologize and blamed a staffer for approving the ad. I was not pleased. Who are these people? Of course, the party went into damage control mode and asked me to help. I certainly did not realize at the time this challenge trickled down from the top. We'll have to look that up. What Liberal MP did it? Oh, but I'm not surprised there, Jody, that there's racists within the Liberal Party. I mean, just look at those blackface Trudeau pictures, right? Oh, okay, get back to it, guys. We gotta Google that. Throughout the campaign, and as would be the case during my time in Ottawa, when challenges arose or things upset me, I turned to those closest to me to confirm the facts, test my interpretations of what was going on, and challenge my assumption. Tim has always been unrelenting in telling me the truth, whether about political realities or how I might be thinking or acting. He is my greatest champion, but also my hardest critic. Lee is the same. Both of them call it like it is and check me when I might be getting out of line, having illusions, or becoming overly hopeful. On the campaign, this loving support was indispensable. On election night, we watched the results on TV in our condo. My mom, Tim, Lee, Corey, and my three nieces, Kaya, Kaylin, and Cadence. We were all waiting for that tick to appear at some point next to my name and photo. We had heard from our volunteers at polling station that the numbers showed that we had won comfortably, but we were waiting for the media to call the race. We were nervous, and while Tim and I have long been a supportive and loving team of two, we have a tendency to feed each other's nerves. My mother has the opposite effect on me, and I needed her there. She has always been a constant support, bringing consistency, strictness, and love to our relationship. Her whole life has been dedicated to the well-being of Corey and me, and she has always kept us stable even when other support was missing. And as has always been the case in the big moments of our lives, Corey and I were together on election night. In my first memories, Corey is always there. Like any sister, there are times we poke each other, but we are each other's foundations in life. Our lives have always been together, and they always will be. And her daughters are like mine and Tim's. When the tick appeared on the TV screen next to my name, it was done. The 42nd Canadian general election saw the Liberal Party win 184 seats, 17 seats in British Columbia, enabling it to form a majority government with Justin Trudeau as the next dictator of Canada. Prime Minister of Canada. I've been reading too long, guys. Sorry. We finally made it to our victory party at the Diamond Ballroom on West 8th Street near Granville Street. Our team showed up gradually. Vancouver-Granville was a late riding to be called, and many of our team were still on the polling stations. We had not really planned a victory party. We didn't have music picked out, so the same 3 songs played over and over. No one seemed to care. I gave a speech, though some of the media seemed annoyed at how late the speech came. Afterwards, many of us headed over to the large Liberal victory party at 2nd Avenue in Olympic Village at a brew pub called the Steel Toad. It was packed. When we all arrived, there was a huge applause, and I was guided up on stage to make a speech. The room was electric. Everyone wanted to take a photo, buy me a drink, or chat. We had won a majority. Sunny days were here. Canada was back. We broke away from the crowded party to spend some much-needed time with our other amazing team at the campaign office, and then Tim, Lee, Rick, and I had our own quiet celebration. I was so tired. We all were. We went back to our condo, had some champagne, and reflected on the reality that after this night, life was going to change dramatically. We were Ottawa bound, whatever that meant. End of chapter. So going over chapter 2, Jody went to law school. She had her own courtroom and specialized in drug treatment court. I think that was around the time she was first running. Funny how she fought for all of this stuff and like nothing ever came about it. It's really frustrating. And then she talked about Robert Pickton and how he murdered mostly the Indigenous women. And he just was eligible here for day parole just a few months ago. Like, I don't even know why that was up for debate. And I have a short video on YouTube, as well as a longer video, and I can't remember now what it's called, and it just goes back to show how right now in 2024 the Liberal NDP coalition are giving more rights to criminals and less to the victims. It's unreal, guys. It's unreal. And it was called Ground Zero, where Robert Pickton had all these women in Vancouver, or British Columbia. The province right now, British Columbia, is a mess. They decriminalized hard drugs, so now people are smoking crack in the hospitals, and nurses are worried about breastfeeding. Like, Jody Wilson was trying to make change like everyone else, and the Liberal NDP coalition has literally wrecked Canada because all of these issues were going on, and look at the shape Canada is in, but particularly British Columbia right now. And again, I'm not too sure about land treaties and all of that stuff, but like Jody Wilson Raybould said in 1993, the land questions were being discussed, the BC treaties, so that they could self-govern. I mean, everything that the Indigenous people were promised, was just taken back. And, then Jody talked about the misogyny and sexism amongst the Assembly chiefs, right? Because there's good and bad in everybody. Anyways, there's good and bad in everybody, guys. And we have to remember that, okay? She talked about, all this real change, but inaction. What else do I have here? She got stink eye from the Liberal cabinet members. She spoke about the Indian Act treats Indigenous people like they're kids and like they're unsophisticated, which is kind of how she felt from some of the Liberal cabinet ministers, the ones that are so inclusive and diverse and anti-bullying. I think it's really important to point out that Jody said how the Liberals, and like any politician, they're always strategizing and trying to beat the bad guys. Okay, it's never, and it's about how can they get back in, how can they keep getting on, rather than what they were elected for, which was to work for every Canadian, not fill their pockets. She said it wasn't smooth with some Liberals. The Liberals always came first. Holding on to power was more important than upholding the values and principles. And she felt like she was in an environment that lost its soul. Yep, if you look around Canada, Canada looks like it's lost its soul, and then some, guys. Jody talked about being a token, as she attended trips with Trudeau that other ministers didn't attend, and she always had to be with him. And why was that? It was for the photo ops, which she mentioned. She also talked about the Pride Parade in Vancouver. And you know what? When that went on, when Trudeau walked his first Pride Parade, I remember feeling like, who is this guy? It's like he thinks he invented gay. And guys, I mentioned in this chapter, how did we get here? We really have to think about that, guys. We all relied on somebody else's information. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, holy moly, Jody Wilson Raybould's Indigenous, she's a woman. We should probably listen to what she had to say. And how come we didn't, guys? Because we worried about what other people think. And I think that ties into a lot of white people, I think, because I feel it. We feel bad for the colonialism. We feel bad that we were a part of that. But when you look at all of it, it was our governments that were actually causing the colonialism, yes, with white people. And frankly, I think the reason why people, didn't want to think for themselves was out of fear for being a racist, being looked at as a racist, because we do feel guilt from what has happened in previous generations. I don't know, guys, that's just what I think. That's just kind of, because again, Trudeau, when he got in, all this real change, he wanted dialogue, and I'd like dialogue too. So tell me what you think. Man, guys, I feel like this is the biggest book report of my life, okay? Biggest book report of my life. I better get an A+ for this, baby. Stay true. Get to talking. Get to reading. Okay, chapter 3 will be coming up. And it is called Sworn In. Okay, guys? All right.